Good afternoon. Welcome to this discussion about cemeteries, graves, and burials. It's a great pleasure to have here today Mr. Roger Luckhurst. He makes essays. He's a professor in the Milton College in the University of London, and he's one of the experts of the Gothic culture and the fear culture, which we all love. He goes from the Victorian mummies to The Shining from Stephen King, from science fiction and culture, and he brings us a classical thing which is Gothical, an illustrated story.
Those who love horror adore them, of course. Sure. So thank you very much. Avui el Roger ve a parlar-nos del seu...
Today, Roger comes to talk about his more recent book, which is Cemeteries, Graves and Burials, a story about living with death. You've got his book here, and this is a visual path through spaces where dead people stay, and an essay on what these spaces tell us living people still. We've been discussing together while having some coffee and water. It's going to be a paradox because we're going to talk about death, this reality we are so afraid about and fascinated about as well. And we hide it and turn it into an art, into literature, and as we are going to see during this discussion, into tourism as well. Roger, thanks for being here today with us. Thanks for being here in this trip together. And I hope we're going to travel from the pyramids in Egypt to the Victorian cemeteries in London. We are going to visit the Toraja rituals and big mausoleum or bodies such as Evita Peron's old age appear in his book. But I'd like to start out by fascination because, of course, you cannot write such a book without being fascinated by death beforehand. Let's start our trip. You talk about Scheherazade, about 1001 Nights, and you say that our relationship with death is that maybe we're always trying to explain one more story. There are many stories here. From the fascination from cemeteries to funerary practices, religious rituals related to the death, because this book is like a Bible about death. But as a funeral Scheherazade, which you seduced us with your story. And I like to ask you, where does this fascination about the death people come from, and your interest about our need to live together with them?
Much for coming as well, everyone. And it's such a great festival this. I came a couple of years ago and had a delightful time. So thank you so much for coming. Where did this fascination come from? Since you've asked me about an hour ago, I've been trying to think about this. And I think it was when I was quite young, actually. I'm the youngest of 3 children. And I discovered that I had much more of a stomach for horror than my older brother and sister. In other words, I had some power for the first time over my siblings. So I got very interested in horror film. And in England at the time, there was... this was around about late 1970s, early 1980s. There was a big taboo about horror films. There was a moral panic about horror films, which of course made them immensely attractive to very young teenagers. So I was very interested in getting hold of those and watching those as any young person might be. So I was interested in that, fascinated by that. But I think it goes even further back, actually. There's a famous childhood incident where I was taken to the Tower of London. Some of you might have been when I was 5. And apparently I was incredibly annoyed that there were no actual heads of the beheaded royal family there. I was very disappointed, very upset. So there's kind of a gruesomeness about my interest, I think, from quite a young age, really. And this book in particular, I guess like many projects, came out partly of COVID. So when we were only allowed out in 2020 for an hour a day, I don't know what the rules were in Spain, but that was all we were allowed. There was a very small local park very near where I live, and that had a place that sold coffee. That was the only place that was open. And I just became interested in why that park was there. And of course, it was a cemetery, or had been a cemetery, but a pauper cemetery, so for very poor people who were buried 12 deep with no memorials at all. And in fact, their bones had only just been rediscovered about 10 or 15 years before. And so I became very interested actually in starting to track around the area where I lived in London to discover that actually the street I lived on had not 1 or 2, but 9 cemeteries from the 19th century, none of which survived at all. So any kind of small square of grass had been a pauper cemetery, largely for immigrants and for Irish workers who were working in the city. So I became very interested in kind of tracking those and, play areas and parks and all those sorts of places. To the extent that I would say to my wife, should we go for a walk? And she'd say, it's not to another burial pit, is it? Or it's not to another graveyard. Might be, maybe. So that kind of was the immediate impetus for this. So that was the kind of historical research that I did during lockdown, and then I expanded it from that, so to try and tell the full story.
A veure, sí que és veritat que...
It's true that this fascination by death, for some people, it means that there is some morbosity or a dark side of it. But your book has an anthropologic approach rather than darkness associated to death. As you already said, in this cemetery, which was maybe a playark, death is a domestic and everyday presence, as a matter of fact. But you already say at the beginning, I think, I suppose that due to its images, you talk about human remains, because in fact death is related to bodies as well, and about what we do with our bodies after death. In Spain, for example, we have some examples as the black person in Bañolas or the Guanches. Mummies in Tenerife, there's been a lot of polemics about it, and in England and everywhere as well, of course, about mummies. There's been a lot of polemics involved. After all the research you've done, Roger, what do you think, how these bodies are treated today? What do you think about that? Did it change your way of thinking, of approaching these dead bodies and the limits in between respect and curiosity for them?
It's a really good question. It's a difficult question, I think, as well. I was quite interested in, as you say, taking an anthropological point of view. So I didn't want to be disrespectful. In fact, I think until very recently, we're fine, actually, at looking at other cultures' dead bodies. And there is a certain, perhaps, unhealthy obsession with that. So the most famous exhibits in London, where I live, are the Egyptian mummies in the British Museum. But there are also quite a lot of medical museums, and they display the bodies or the skeletons of giants. So there's a famous Irish giant who was on display in a medical museum until only 10 years ago, and was displayed alongside a person who suffered from dwarfism, so very small body. And these were kind of spectacular displays. They had been very famous during their life, but also in their death. You can still go and look at the body of the Elephant Man, for example, these sorts of spectacular things. And this is definitely unhealthy, I think. So what I wanted was to kind of get a sense of why are we so obsessed with those sorts of displays, because they're taboo. They're not really proper forms. They're like body worlds. You might have a body worlds exhibition here as well. They just happen all over the world. Those sorts of plasticated displays of bodies. So there's a popular culture about that. So I wanted an anthropological view of it. And I think the most helpful anthropologist I found was this amazing young writer who wrote a piece about the representation of death in 1907 called Robert Hertz. He was a very brilliant sociologist who was killed in the First World War, so he only wrote 2 books. But he basically said that there are always 2 deaths. There is the biological death, and then at some period or some interval afterwards, there is a second symbolic death, so the funeral or whatever rituals that happen around that. And basically in between those 2 deaths is an infinite kind of human variety of what we might do. And I think we are all brought up with a certain cultural feeling about what's right and what our customs are. And we sort of live with those, we don't necessarily think about those. But any slight variation we see in other cultures, we become really obsessed by. And it can be really minor, I think, as well. So, for example, there's a shared link between the United Kingdom and the United States in the sense that they're broadly, Protestant kind of cultures. But the Americans have a whole process of viewing of the body, so you kind of go on a ritual kind of viewing. It's a very important part of the process that you see the body before it's buried. And that to the UK, in the UK, is just not done. It feels very odd and very strange. And that's to say nothing about the weird stuff Catholics get up to. And that sort of sense of this kind of, you're always othering, or you're always exoticizing other people's rituals. So there are very few ossuaries, so bone stores left in England, are only about 3. And that's associated very much more with southern Europe and Catholicism and Spain and Italy and the weird, strange fetishism that Catholics have of dead bodies, relics, all this sort of stuff. So you start to define your culture almost by your death rituals, I think, and then you start to other death rituals. So that's why colonial projects were so fascinated, actually, by death rituals. When the Jesuits, I write about this in the book, when the Jesuits went to North America, they were completely bewildered by some of the rituals of the Native American customs, which are incredibly elaborate and ritualized and can take years. A village moves, but they move their bones with them, or they ritualistically display bones. And the Jesuits wrote volumes and volumes and volumes about this heathen kind of activity as they saw it. And I think that's what kind of cultures have done. And I think that's also partly our obsession with ancient Egypt as well, is that it's slightly exoticizing all the time. So I wanted to kind of do a book that was respectful of these different kind of cultures and faiths. And part of that was teaching myself, I think, about, if you go to a Jewish cemetery, you put on a hat, but if you go to a Christian one, you take off your hat. And just things like this, what I wanted to kind of almost have like a guide for myself, how am I supposed to behave in these kind of places, and where did those rituals and those kind of customs come from. And so that was part of the whole exploration of the book as well. So it's very much there's a whole chapter called Death and Faith, which goes across Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. And it's not that I knew an incredible amount about those when I started, but I just wanted to kind of educate myself in those kinds of, just as a set of examples of how people had different customs and how those customs developed.
Sí, jo crec que és un llibre molt respectuós i molt empàtic, també, no?
With a lot of empathy as well. I mean, you help us a lot to put ourselves in the shoes of other cultures and understand other ways of looking at death. You make a historic evolution, and you talk about contemporary death as well from these different cultures. There is a moment in contemporary death in many books in times. You talk about Philip Arias, who wrote Death in the Western World, and to summarize, he says before sex was taboo, and the same thing happened with death, that there is this duality. You said that this discussion is going to be a paradox. Death is a paradox, and we try to hide the death on the one hand, but we consume it actually. And he talks about pornography of death. What do you think about that after studying so much in this book? What do you think we do with death? We deny it, we banalize it. What is our relationship with death, and what is yours as well?
That's a small question. I think Philip Arias, who was a French historian, read a very brilliant book about the history of kind of funeral practice and so on, but he was quite a conservative Catholic. And his whole kind of argument in the last 100 pages or so of his book is that basically things are getting much worse. Modern world is getting much worse because the religious framework has been taken away. And what he talks about very influentially is this idea of we are bracketing off or we are protecting ourselves from death. And that's happened since doctors took over from priests. So we no longer die at home in bed with the good death, as it's sometimes called, amongst your family members. Your priest reads your last rites over you, etc., etc. So that's the good death. Now we are taken out of the house, we're taken out of the family, people are put into terminal wards in hospitals, the access is very restricted, the dying themselves don't necessarily have rights over what's happening to their own body, and we have kind of bracketed this away, and that's been a very, very influential argument. And at the same time, he's kind of saying, so as we're bracketing real death away, what we need, it seems, is this huge display in culture of what he calls a pornography of death. So this sort of sense of, every other film has to be a zombie film. We have to have the obligatory scene of, bodies being ripped open and intestines kind of devoured. All of that sort of stuff, I think. Philip Arias, I get the sense, would probably not be a fan of Night of the Living Dead. And he sees these as kind of symbiotic and a sign of lack of, a healthy attitude towards death. I think about it slightly differently. I think it's certainly the case that things like horror films are the place where we can rehearse kind of arguments about what it means to live and die, what mourning is. I think some of the strongest, most brilliant works about mourning are in horror films themselves, actually. Some of you might have seen a very, very strong horror film this year called Bring Her Back, which is about a grieving mother who is prepared to do actually anything to bring her dead child back. It's very strong. If you don't have a strong stomach, don't see it. But it is actually a really profound investigation of grieving and our relationship to just the materiality of death itself and of the body of the loved one. And you really don't get that anywhere, I think. We have kind of turned death into a scientific, very distant object. And I think people are moved into, if you've been to terminal wards or you've been in the very difficult situation of visiting a loved one in that situation, it is like going into a different world now. You go through a set of doors and you've left ordinary world behind. And I think that it's something that is a very profound and difficult experience for all of us, of course. So we kind of do need something, I think, to kind of translate that. And some people might feel that horror film or fiction or genre fiction is a very crude way of dealing with it, but actually I think it's full of profundity. It's full of really, really interesting. So I wouldn't call it a pornography of death. That feels like a very high culture judgment of low culture. But actually, of course, low culture is there for a reason, and it can process lots of things for us.
Seguim, no obstant,
Well, we are still in this paradox of death. On the one hand, we hide it away, but we turn it into beauty as well. Because a lot of marvels in the world, as the pyramids, the Taj Mahal, the Halicarnasso mausoleum, are funerary monuments. Death becomes art and beauty. It's fascinating, in fact, because this is what we associate with eternity, maybe. Maybe it comes from the wish to remember dead people. And in your book, you talk about this need to turn death into a monument. What have you been more impressed about this transformation into art? And is there any specific place which have highly impacted you, or you haven't still had the chance to visit?
Yes, I think there is. We need to be aware that that nearly all tourism actually is to do with death ultimately. We might both go to cities and then immediately go to cemeteries, but that's because of who we are. But nevertheless, people are going to the Great Pyramids. Pyramids are amazing. They're truly extraordinary, and I have been there. But Angkor Wat is also an amazing funerary complex. The Taj Mahal, all sorts of these places. But it's kind of the smaller ones that really affect me, I think. So when I was in Egypt, it wasn't necessarily the grand pyramids, the Great Pyramids, or even the Valley of the Kings. But there are other tombs that you can visit which are kind of off the beaten track, which are just, and they're for, nobles, but not for kings and queens. But they are nevertheless just extraordinary, and very much they've got more personal touches, I think, of a sort of sense of a family that are very aware that they need to produce this kind of ritual and these artworks and these materials for their loved one to continue for a safe journey to the other side. And it's those sorts of things that are really affecting. So one of the most famous poems in the English language is Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which is just about a small churchyard where the names are fading from the headstones, and it's a reflection on passing of time and so on. It's a very, very famous poem. And that's certainly true, I think. It's stopping almost accidentally and discovering a country churchyard, which is very affecting. Or if you've been through northern France and you come across a very small graveyard to, a Commonwealth graveyard for, a small number of British soldiers or French soldiers, those can be incredibly affecting, much more than the really grand monuments, I think. So it's that sort, and that's why it's called Living with the Dead, a history of living with the dead, because it's that sort of sense of stumbling across it in the course of your life, rather than necessarily going, right, we're going to the Giza pyramids now, and we're going to do that kind of journey. It is extraordinary, but it's nevertheless, it's a filtered experience because you've seen so many images of it and you kind of know what you're getting. Whereas it's the surprise, I think, of certain artifacts that really get you.
Passem del que són els llocs.
Let's move from places to rituals. You talk about them as well. You talk about moments and rituals as well. At the end of the day, death is a ritual as well. The way we treat it, which makes us humans somehow, as you say. And these are the rituals you describe. And sometimes I felt like being there in the rituals because you have a very visual and poetic way of describing them. Among all the rituals you talk about, the Toraja rituals, I've been impressed about the ceiling graves in burials in Babylonia and Tibet. Which ones have you impressed you more? Not the Egypt ones, or maybe the hell burials, which the ceiling burials, or.
Yes. So I think that this is partly to do with a sort of sense of wonder or exotic nature of some rituals, but that's exotic to us. But there is a certain kind of logic, I think, and a very different way of thinking about death, say, from an English Protestant kind of position. And that's what can be really quite striking in Buddhism, for example. I think some of the rituals around Buddhist ceremonies are really quite striking. That was one of the things that most surprised me, because I think, so in Britain, cremation was illegal. You weren't allowed to do it until 1885, so very kind of late. And that's partly to do with a full Christian belief in bodily resurrection, so you need the body to be resurrected. And I always assumed that Buddhism was about cremation in order to release the kind of spirit, and that's certainly the case. It is the case that that's a kind of core. But there is a whole a material, bodily element to Buddhism, which I hadn't really encountered before, just even down to the death of the Buddha himself. It was agreed that the body would be divided in 4, and that these princes would take them off to take the remains off as relics to establish new sites. The only problem being is that 8 princes turned up for the funeral, so they had to divide the body in 8. And then, about 2 generations later on, it was decided that one of the 8ths of the body of the Buddha would be divided into 64,000 pieces and be sent as across the globe, so that every Buddhist stupa, as they're called, they contain a piece of the actual Buddha. That was the idea. So it's a very kind of physiological kind of thing, and yet this is just a kind of point of departure for a whole series of elaborate rituals around those monuments, if you like. So it's such an incredibly elaborate thing, which I had known nothing about just from where I come from. So that was really intriguing, and I think I knew about. Some of you might know about sky burial. So this is in Tibet, up in the high mountains, because there is no way of burying bodies. What they tended to do was have these special ritual areas where you leave the bodies out in the open air. Some Buddhist traditions contemplate the decay of the body just as it's lying there for over a course of a year, actually. But there are other places in Tibet where the vultures are trained kind of to come down and sort of start to pick apart the body. And this is a release. I mean, it's a release of the spirit. It's a very kind of ritualized thing. and a very religious and sort of solemn process. But it's something that, of course, it's so exotic, it's so different, that it becomes this sort of object of fascination. And that's partly why access to Tibet is so difficult now, because there's a sort of sense of wanting to constrain and control what has become a tourist exercise. And you kind of see, absolutely, that should be a solemn ritual and not be an object of display. But on the other hand, it's also the case that this is a kind of place where repression can occur as well of a culture. So it's a flashpoint. This is the key lesson of the book, I think, for me, when I was writing it, is that you can't write about death rituals without writing about politics. And that was really surprised me in the end.
Of course, sí, és veritat. No...
True. You cannot talk about rituals or about death without talking about politics. But you cannot talk about death without talking about cemeteries, and you talk about them a lot. And you talk about you talk about Jean Sparkling, the Silence Mansions, where she says that one life can be explained through the cemeteries that accompanied her in silence. And you talk about cemeteries as well. So, which are your cemeteries that have accompanied you in silence or not, or which have fascinated you the most all through your research process?
Yes, so there's a lovely book by Jean Sprackland, who's a poet who follows her life through the cemeteries that are nearest to where she lived. And actually, there's I'm sure you all know Mariana Enriquez, but her brand new book is exactly the same. So it's about the cemeteries around the world that she's visited and been really interested in. Having sat on this stage with Mariana Enriquez about 3 years ago, I was terrified to discover that she'd written exactly the same book, because she's such a brilliant writer, and it's a fantastic book. It's already been translated into English, and it's extraordinary. So go and read that as well. As far as I've always been very interested in. Maybe this is partly morbid, but I live in a Victorian city, so I live in a 19th century city, London, and London has had a huge problem with being the largest city in the world in the 19th century, and therefore had the largest population of the dead to deal with. And they were nearly always slow in being able to deal with that. So there's there's a period of time in the 19th century when it was a complete free-for-all. You could do whatever you want, really, with just opening up small parcels of land and turning it into a cemetery and just hurling in bodies, as many as you could, for profit. And this was a huge kind of scandal by the 1830s and 1840s. So I've been very interested in those sort of small kind of places. Again, most of them haven't survived. But there are ones that have survived and that have their great protectors as well. So people who, I don't know if it's the case here, but nearly every cemetery across Britain, actually, but that has friends. They form societies, very interested in the history. They track the individuals who are buried there. They have tour guides. People get very passionate about that, and I love that whole kind of culture. It means that every audience I talk to always has great stories to tell me about their specific, kind of locations. I was giving a talk in Scotland 3 weeks ago, and there's a famous, one of my favourite headstones, tombstones, is in Scotland, because they were holding a funeral in a churchyard, and they saw, this is in 1832, they saw cholera arrive, literally cholera arrive, as a cloud on the seashore, and they grabbed it in a bag, somehow, and then they buried it under this giant stone. So it's called the cholera stone. And someone in the audience just said, "Oh, that was my great-great-great grandfather in the photograph you just shown." So stories like that are always amazing. So there's that. I think Père Lachaise in Paris is a cliche. It's the most visited cemetery in the world, but it is extraordinary. It's totally extraordinary, I think. And it's got lots of little kind of micro stories everywhere, and there's always something new to learn about it. And it's the same with Highgate as well, Highgate Cemetery, where I lived quite near it for a while when I was a student. So that sort of sense of those sorts of places, Highgate is one of the famous so-called Magnificent Seven, the 7 cemeteries that were built around London to try and solve the problem of too many dead. And it is a very Gothic place. And it has its own Egyptian area as well, because that was fashionable at the time. So it's got lots of lovely architecture in. So I think it's a combination of different things. It's local stories, it's evocative kind of stories. You can have very grand places like Highgate, but then you can also have, one of my recent discoveries has been a very modest graveyard, which is barely held on to existing because it's been so marginal. But it's called the Crossbones, and it's the burial ground where it's just outside the legal boundary of the old City of London. And it was a place where sex workers, prostitutes, were buried unmarked and were, completely disregarded. But they had been serving, the population of London. And this was where they were buried. And that has its really passionate defenders. There's a huge amount of developers who are very keen on getting that land and developing that land. And there's a community of resistors against that. It's a great story. It's a really wonderful story. And it's just a kind of corner almost now of a patch of land, but nevertheless something that is just such a kind of focus of political dispute. It's really lovely.
Yes, it's not only interesting, it's passionating, the kind of stories you can explain in cemeteries and the stories you explain in these cemeteries, because we have some memories of cemeteries, and sometimes we make some politician denounces. There is indigenous cemetery in Canada, which is important for people who love there. You've been talking about Père Lachaise, and through your book, we can visit these cemeteries and understand the stories in them. And my question, because we will move to the Q&A, I wanted to ask you about the book structure itself. Somehow, well, you talk about cemeteries, rituals, etc., but you structure this book about origin of burials, death and faith, which you are interested about as well, and infinite amount of death. There, okay, we are surrounded by dead people. Of course, there are more dead people than alive. And you are talking about governance terms like Vita Peron's politicians and death. Why do you, which is the criteria you applied when you decided to talk about death?
The project that we decided to do together with my editor Ben, he said, I want you to explain death, all of it, from the beginning of time to now, and also across the globe. And can you do that in about 50,000 words, please? So that was, it was like a huge kind of project. And it's also structured with the opening is graves before graveyards. So when did that start? And actually, that's a really difficult question. It used to be thought that humans, Homo sapiens, were defined partly by their care in burying their dead, but actually that's the species that existed, hominid species, were doing that as well. So that we're having to push back that chronology all the time. And so that sort of investigation of that, does this define us as humans? You know, is how we bury, how we care for the dead. That was kind of the initial part. I wanted to look definitely at across the globe through faith, because that can take up, you know, several billion people and how they kind of think about death and so on. But also be able to indicate beyond that there are hundreds and hundreds of other ways of being able to do this. And then I wanted to think about what I call the great majority. This is a phrase that was used in English in the 19th century. You are going to the great majority, which means that, you know, you are joining the huge number of dead. And really it's the numberless dead as the population rises that becomes the real problem for the last 250 years, say. So I wanted to kind of explore that. And then just try and get continuities going through. So there are some very, you know, we know about the Egyptian mummies, but less about the Chinese amazing jade mummies from China, or from Chile, you know, which are far older than the Egyptians. So, you know, follow those through, but then also our special dead, our significant dead, and they tend to be political leaders now. And the dead bodies of political leaders are really interesting as a subject. I mean, we know, I guess, about Lenin, and Lenin is still preserved there in Red Square. But I didn't know that the family that had embalmed Lenin then went on to do, across several generations, every single communist leader up to the present day, actually. And it's a kind of family tradition, but also a family curse. They had a secret formula that they wouldn't tell Stalin, because if they told Stalin, they would have been killed. And they wanted to preserve Stalin, which indeed they did, before he was buried later. So, you know, there's a whole kind of interesting thing about that. Everyone, of course, knows about the gruesome story of Evita, you know, Eva Peron, and the posthumous kind of travels of her body as well are quite famous. The same, I guess, a little bit with Franco as well. You know, that's also an issue about what to do with these difficult political kind of bodies. So I wanted to explore that as well. So it's kind of it's cutting across space, but also wanting to cut across time, but also giving enough space to, you know, modern day issues that we all kind of connect with as well. So I think I was trying to do everything.
I think that death is eternal. And we are not eternal yet, for the moment. We are still living. We are here in body and soul, and we are running out of money, what I'm saying, of time. And we have questions for the eternity, but maybe among the audience, somebody would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Hola, bona tarda. Moltes gràcies per aquest...
Good afternoon. Thanks for such an interesting discussion. Did you visit any cemetery in Barcelona? And do you know the history of the saint in the Poblenou cemetery?
So I came to the festival, I think 3 years ago, and I was here with David Scal, who said, when he heard that this was going to be my next project, he said, you just got to go to Poblenou cemetery and look at the kiss of death. So that famous kind of image. So the photograph that I took there is in the book for this. And Poblenou was a very useful cemetery for me because it fits perfectly actually with the idea of reforming cemeteries in the beginning of the 19th century. It seems to me that the Spanish reformers of that cemetery had in a sense, a much more rational and modern kind of conception of how you might manage the numberless dead because of this kind of sense of, niches, but then also removing remains after a certain kind of time. The whole problem in Britain is that you are buried eternally. So that's, your plot is kind of eternal. Whereas many European cultures have a sort of sense of you're renting land for a while, and then you kind of cycle bodies out and do other things with the remains. So in other words, the ritual doesn't end with burial, but there is a kind of whole series of activities you might happen afterwards. So I was interested in Pablo now, but I know there are many, every single city has fascinating particular instances, and I know that Barcelona particularly is full of them as well. But that was the one I went to.
Falta Montjuïc, eh?
You have to go to Montjuïc Cemetery as well.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Yeah, it's one
Sí, yo quería saber si
How do you think that cemeteries can evolve, at least in Western countries? Because there is kind of fear and banalization of death rituals.
And the last chapter or so is partly about the changing attitudes towards this. One of the big lessons I learned quickly was, and it's made it even more difficult, is that there's no kind of obvious progression or development. Cultures change their minds about burial practices very suddenly. Most famously, Roman culture was all about, cremation for a long time, and then they switched to burial at a very specific moment, and historians aren't entirely persuaded about why that happened. And with us, I think it's the same. So the natural burial movement, so this idea of, an ecological burial using only biodegradable materials and so on. In the UK, that movement has only really been going since the 1990s, very, very recent. And that idea of the garden cemetery has become something even more of a natural kind of landscape, really. And so you don't want to actually leave a mark on the landscape, or else you leave a mark in a natural way. So, many people want to be buried underneath a tree, or to become the feed for a tree, and that's a very popular way of burial these days. So that's a kind of development, and it's also a sort of sense of an acknowledgement, perhaps a more secular idea that you're joining a cycle of life and returning, your carbon to the ground, and it being recycled. So there's that, I think. I was very aware, because I read lots of histories of cemeteries, is that nearly every last chapter was always a lament. It's like, oh, it's all terrible now. And I wanted to not do that, to do something different. And just talk about the explosion of different ways of kind of doing this, some of which, you might find really strange. I do. So this idea of you can get remains and have them crushed under very high pressure and turn the carbon into diamonds, and then you just wear it as jewelry if you want. Or else you can take a small portion of your remains and have them fired into space at various different levels. You can go into low Earth orbit, which is quite cheap. Or you can be aimed at the moon, which is very expensive. Or you can go into deep space, forever, kind of go out there forever if you want, which is even more expensive. And the difficulty being you have to rely on Elon Musk to deal with your remains, which I'm not sure I would want. I wouldn't want that. So it's constantly evolving, I think, is the answer. And I think we're very aware of ecological issues now with land and land use, which has changed, I think, how we think about cemeteries, particularly burial grounds, particularly.
De fet,
In your last chapter, you talk about it as well. And this is something very important too. you talk as well about a future in death, but I mean, death as an option. As an option, isn't it a bit terrifying or fascinating? What do you think?
Yeah, it's, so I think there has been the Silicon Valley billionaires are obsessed with life extension, but they want to, and one of them has said, I see death as entirely optional now. But you have to have a certain kind of salary, I think, to think that. And also, it's an illusion that every single person in power, man in power, has dreamt of from the beginning of time. I mean, that's what these mausoleums are. It's what the pyramids are. It's what it's a monument to wanting to be eternal. It's just what really wealthy people want. So I think that idea that currently that death is an option. I think the pharaohs would have agreed with Silicon Valley billionaires. Absolutely, I've made it an option by investing all of this, kind of wealth in my whole death package that I've put together for my pyramid. I will be eternal. So I think it's just a lifelong kind of, a history-long human failing to think that you can overcome death.
Pero bueno, hem de ser de Silicon Valley, eh?
Well, we have to be from Silicon Valley for it to be real now.
Jo volia preguntar si fora de l'entorn europeu
outside of Europe, do the burial places play with physical borders of cemeteries? I think about Sabadell. The cemetery is across the other side of the river, far away from the city. And many cemeteries do not only have a wall to separate them from us symbolically. Does it happen somewhere else in the world as well, apart from in the Western countries?
Yeah, I think it does. Yes. So we have this kind of. I think we're most kind of strongly aware of this from Roman law. So that idea that you can't bury inside the city limits. So there is a metropolis, but there is a necropolis that goes alongside it. So and that's codified in Roman law from quite early on. But you also get, actually it makes perfect sense in terms of hygiene, to kind of separate living and the dead. So, the Etruscans did that as well. And that idea is taken into many other cultures as well. You see that across the world. I think the thing that most kind of concerns us, or we feel is the most other, is quite often the opposite. It's the proximity. So that idea of living with the dead for a long time, or else the idea of death is so different that there are some cultures in Indonesia where the body, someone has biologically died, but they're not considered dead for at least a year. So they're kind of they live with the family. They have their own food. They're part of a kind of cultural world, participation in that kind of world. And that sort of proximity was the thing that always gets the most exoticized, I think, is that because it's so different from Western conceptions, and particularly in modernity, the separation of living from the dead, this thing that Philip Ariès complained about, this sort of medicalization and what sociologists call the sequestration of death. You sequester it somewhere. So you see elsewhere both proximity but also very elaborate kind of forms of ritual distance as well. So, yeah.
No sé si ens queda temps.
We have the time for another question. 4 minutes. We have 4 minutes. Okay. You have a question? No. So to finish the last 4 minutes, of course we could be talking eternally, but my question now is, how did you elaborate this work? Traveling, researching in libraries? How can write a book like that, apart from telling your wife to accompany you to cemeteries as well?
It's a combination of things. So one of the things that I became aware of was there were so many amazing sounding cemeteries that are just not available to a Western tourist, which is what I would be. So, you know, the largest cemetery in the world is in Iraq, in Najaf, which has a population of 6 million dead, and the city of Najaf, I think, is 500,000 living. So that kind of sense of, you know, a vast kind of place. Lots in China. One of my favorite sounding cemeteries is the cemetery in Zimbabwe for the heroes of the revolution, which is a cemetery shaped like an AK-47 rifle. And the heroes are buried as if they are the bullets in the magazine of the AK-47, which is really hardcore in terms of celebrating independence and, you know, the violent overthrow of your oppressors. So there are places like that that I could only read about. There's an extraordinary amount of materials available, say, in London and Paris, in libraries and in, you know, local record offices that have lots and lots of, you know, records of cemeteries and so on. It's not really that kind of book, but I did look at those, some of those, got very interested in some of those. So yeah, it's a combination of and also accident, you know, like coming across things that you, or you just happen to be going to cities that you then get very interested in for their burial practices. So it's partly journey, mostly being a professor sitting in a library.
Jo vull tenir aquest carnet de...
I want to have this privilege of being a professor and a researcher to discover part of things you did in your book. Thank you very much, Roger. Thanks for reminding us that talking about death is talking about us, about living people. That cemeteries are not only places for silence, but they can be a memory, a beauty, denounce, etc. It has been a great pleasure to follow this path with you among graveyards, graves. There are lots of cemeteries as well, but now all of them, or most of them, are in this one, in this book of Roger Luckhurst, Cemeteries, Graves and Burials, and he can sign the book for you. Now, thank you very much, and carpe diem.